Today, we're going to be talking about sustainability and specifically about sustainability measures for IT. If that's not what you're expecting or not what you signed up for, feel free to check out now. But for those of you that are going to stay with us, today we're going to talk about quite a broad view of sustainability and particularly why are we measuring it for IT. We're going to talk about sort of the motivations and the why behind needing to do measurement. We're going to talk about the different areas of IT that need to be measured and some of the things we can do to create those measures. We're going to try and stretch our minds a bit on the definition of sustainability, and we're going to talk about the actual process of gathering the data, recording, analysing and presenting the results a little bit as well. I'm going to try and keep it quite a high level today, but I'm going to speak for around 40 minutes, and then we've got some time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to drop in questions as they come up in the Q&A chat. Alternatively, if you like, obviously, we can try and unmute you towards the end of the session. You can ask those questions for yourself. So without further ado, let's get started. So really a very brief introduction to Circularity-First. So we are positioning ourselves as a sustainable IT company, but what does that really mean? Well, actually, we're a group of companies. We operate across the UK, Europe, the United States. We even deliver for customers in Asia. And we've been delivering technology in a more sustainable way for customers for the last 15 years, helping people think about what they're doing and do things in a different way. Like all things in sustainability, it's really important to have some external validation for that. It's not just words. So we work with EcoVadis to be assessed on an annual basis, and they assessed us in their top 1% of companies worldwide. And what does that mean? Well, that's really more about our own internal operations, that we've gone through the journey to try and make ourselves more sustainable before we put ourselves in this position to try and convince others to go on this journey too. And I suppose if I was to summarize that, that's really our purpose, is to take what we've learned over the last 15 years and help other organizations go on this journey to be more sustainable as well. So the meat of what we're going to talk about today is measuring sustainability. But in all things, I think it's worth thinking about the why. Why are we measuring sustainability before we start? Because the motivations have quite a lot to do with ultimately how and what we end up choosing to measure. The first bit I always like to talk about in this space is a bit of a tension. There's a bit of tension between accuracy and urgency, right? We know we need to do something here. We know we need to act. And there's a real kind of question of, well, why are we waiting to get all the measures right? Don't we just need to get on with it? The analogy I like is that we know we're screeching towards a cliff edge, envisaging a car going very, very fast towards a cliff edge. Do we really need to know how fast we're going, or is it more important that we just slam on the brakes? I think it's a good analogy. But I think we do need measures, if anything, just to know that what we're doing in slamming on the brakes is in fact slowing us down. But I'd like you to sort of hold that tension in your mind a little bit as we talk today about, how accurate we should be in measurement before we start taking action. I think it's fair to say for a lot of organizations that one of the biggest drivers here is legislation. So we're sort of being made to measure certain parts of sustainability and particularly carbon. So in the UK, we've got the TFCD, across Europe, or the CRSD, across the US. Different states are taking different approaches, but we're being asked to measure carbon. We're being, laws are being written to tell us that we have to measure carbon. And obviously that's a big driver for organizations. But equally, we're just starting to see taxation rear its head. Across Europe, we now have something called CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And that's the first element of taxation to sort of force reduction, not just measurement. But of course, we need to accurately measure it to know what taxes need to be paid. I think we have to recognise that this is also quite an emotive subject for people. That a lot of people come at this from a moralistic point of view. That we need to act. That we must act. I like Simon Sinek's expression. He talks about, we're not trying to save the planet here. We're actually trying to save ourselves. We're trying to save the human race. So I think it is important we understand when we're creating measures and sending signals about what we're doing from a sustainability point of view, we understand for some that this is quite an emotive subject. On the kind of flip side of that equation a bit is how this directly relates to profitability in businesses. Certainly in our experience over the last 15 years, whenever we're helping organizations become more sustainable, we're nearly always delivering cost savings along with that. So when we think about what we're measuring, sometimes in a sustainability program, you should also be measuring cost savings, because fundamentally that helps reinforce that this is the right thing to do for the business as well as for society. And when we look a little bit more holistically about sustainability and what it means, we start to see that it affects all of our stakeholders in our organization in different ways. So we know if we want to attract and retain the best talent, we need to be thinking about sustainability. We know that a lot of people care about this topic, and if we want to get the very best and the broadest set of people to want to work in our organization, we need to be thinking about what we do here. Likewise, customers, we know that they're voting with their wallets in terms of taking products and services from organizations that are genuinely and meaningfully doing something to become more sustainable. And equally, from a funding point of view, and whether you're privately funded with investment or it's government public funding that you're looking for, we can see the flow of money is largely moving towards projects that deliver greater sustainable outcomes. So if we look at that on the whole, and if I simplify that a little bit, I think really what we're trying to do is make better decisions, and then that better is being expanded to include sustainability. So we're not just talking about cost, we're not talking about quality or performance, we're also talking about sustainability. So really, when we talk about why are we measuring sustainability, it is quite simply to try and make better decisions for all of these reasons. So, but why IT specifically? And certainly over the last few years, I've been asked this question quite a lot. Isn't IT part of the answer? Isn't AI, for example, going to come up with the solutions for us here? Why is IT such an important thing for us to be measuring when talking about sustainability? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. But in order to explain that, I want you to remember one number. I'd like you to remember the number 4, and it's going to be used in different ways. But it's a big 4 because actually the impact from IT, the effect on the environment and in sustainability terms is very large. And let me explain that to you. So if we're just talking carbon for a second, IT already represents 4% of our global emissions as a species. 4%. You might think that's a large number, you might not. It's already double aviation, and most of us know we probably should be flying less. But it's not the 4% that we should be most focused on. It's the 14% that we expect ICT to represent of global emissions by 2040. 14%. That's more than steel and cement, these heavy emitting industries combined. So what that means is it's one of the fastest growing emission streams. And therefore, we really need to be thinking about how we measure it. Now, here in the UK, and I know we have an international audience today, but just by illustration, a quarter of the UK's energy is expected to be used on just data centers and cloud services in 2024. A quarter. That's a huge amount of energy being consumed in one part of IT. But I think probably the most important thing to think about is in your own organization is how much of your carbon footprint is going to be represented in IT. And across our customer base, we see customers ranging from between 18 to 40% of their overall footprint. 40%. So really what we're saying here is no matter what your organization does, probably you're going to need to have IT on your radar as one of the top 4 or 5 things that you're going to need to address. And that's just from a carbon point of view. And we're going to talk more broadly than carbon as we go through today. So I think one of the first challenges we have is a little bit of a definition. How do we define IT? You know, there's things that we know that are obviously IT, but IT touches everything. And in fact, everyone ends up touching IT when trying to do their jobs. And how do we understand the impacts of those different parts of IT? Well, I think first of all, we can start with things that are probably quite obvious and relatively easy to measure. So I think when we talk about IT, and we think about even the devices that are sitting in front of us right now, we know they use electricity. right? We can see that there's light coming off our screens. We can feel the heat coming off devices. And of course, we can measure it. You know, the electric companies will send us bills with watts, megawatts, gigawatts of energy being consumed. You might be surprised to see how big that energy use is. I used the stat there for the UK, but if you added up all the data centers and cloud provision across the world and compared it to countries, it would represent the third largest country by energy use. So after the US and China, the third biggest user of energy is data centers and cloud services. But you know, that's measurable. In your own organization, you should be able to measure energy use relatively easily. The second bit is disposal, right? I think we probably all at home have a drawer that has old phones, maybe laptops or cables and stuff. We can see waste there, what we're no longer using from an IT point of view. We have similar cupboards in our organizations that have that equipment in it. But again, the scale is perhaps bigger than you might know. It's around 60 million tons of e-waste per year. And because we have this weird relationship with technology where we use it for a relatively short space of time and they're willing to give or throw it away. But the problem with e-waste, and particularly the IT component of e-waste, is firstly, how hard it is to recycle. It's extremely difficult to pull back apart these very integrated and soldered together devices to get any useful materials back out. But the second bit is how poisonous it is. We can't even use our age-old method of digging a hole in the ground and burying it, because the chemicals that will leach out will cause massive harm to life. But those are the two I think that should be relatively easy to measure and relatively visible and understood in your organizations. But what sort of sits beneath the surface of this iceberg of impact here? Well, I need you to use your imagination a little bit with me here for a second, and let's visualize how we extract the metals and minerals we need to make IT. Visualize a forest that needs to be cut down in order to get to the soil where the minerals and metals are. Think about all the biodiversity and nature that gets disrupted in that process. Think about then what we need to do to the soil, digging it up and firing water and chemicals at it to get access to those rare metals and minerals. That whole extraction and refining process is massively carbon intensive, but obviously massively disrupts nature and ecosystems. It's a bit harder to measure, right? You can't immediately think about how would you measure that for the technology products that you use. And that's, of course, before we even start the manufacturing process. Start taking those materials and making the little subcomponents and the components and fusing them onto boards and putting them into the cases and completing that manufacturing process through, you know, those assembly lines with sparks flying and chemical processes and heat and everything that's needed to make that device. And then, of course, it's got to get from that manufacturing center, maybe somewhere out in the Far East, and it's got to be transported to your local distributor and then to a reseller before it's then transported and got into your hands. All of that process has a huge amount of carbon and other impacts in it before you even switch a device on. For example, a phone might have maybe 100 kilos of carbon embodied in it, a laptop 500 kilos of carbon embodied in it, and a network switch, for example, would have 2 tons of carbon embodied in it before you've even turned it on. Now, I think when we talk about weight of carbon, sometimes that's quite abstract, but that's more than 10,000 miles driven in an average car. Okay, so that's a lot of carbon for just one network switch. Okay. But let's move beyond the physical devices. Let's think about software. Well, how does software fit into this space? How does software have a footprint? Well, of course, it's the software that determines what hardware we need. It's the software that determines how hard that hardware has to work. And even how we choose to code software, the programming languages that we choose can have a massive impact and ultimately how much energy and carbon we use or emit. So choosing a programming language that's compiled, something like C++ or Java, versus ones that's scripted, could ultimately mean you have like up to a 45% difference in the amount of energy that's used to solve the same software problem. And it's the scripting languages, as I said, like Python, that are so much less efficient from a pure computational point of view. Now, the output of software is often data. So whether that's files or videos, we are constantly moving data around the planet. Now, moving that data has impacts. The more data you have to move, the more that lights up devices that have to do that transportation. But equally, the footprint of that data stored in data centers causes some of the other impacts as we've just talked about in that space. And we store epic amounts of data. It's not like paper that if we have paper with information on it, we might keep it for a while, but more likely to shred it or recycle it, or it'll be done with. Data, we just don't seem to ever want to destroy. So it's just building up and building up and building up. And the final piece of this iceberg from a measurement point of view and to be thinking about is something, again, that can be quite tricky to measure, is about process. It's about policy. It's about people. It's the decisions that we make across all of these things, the little laws or regulations that we write in our organizations that determine a lot of how the rest of technology is used and deployed. So I'll give you one example. We work with a company that used to have a policy that every 2 years it would recycle all of its laptops and get new ones. In this organization, that was 20,000 laptops. And that was a policy decision. And we all work in organizations. We know that sometimes policies can end up being really, really strong, very, very hard to change. But we have to understand that. We have to understand the impact, the measures, the impact of those kind of policies if we're going to have every chance of first of all, measuring these decisions that we're making, but equally reducing them. So how do we define sustainability? Now, that might sound a silly thing. I think inherently we all probably have a feeling of what we think a sustainability is, but I think for a lot of organizations, we don't have a very precise definition of what we mean by sustainability. And certainly what we see in a lot of organizations is quite a simple view of sustainability today. A lot of people are talking just about carbon, and a lot of the focus is going on scope 2 carbon emissions, right? That's energy use, broadly speaking. Okay, now that's understandable. As I said, it's relatively easy to measure. It's relatively easy to try and reduce. But even in IT, a scope 2 emissions is only one part of carbon, and which is only one part of climate change. And climate change is only one part of a broader definition of sustainability. The scope 3 elements in IT are, generally speaking, considerably larger than the scope 2. We would expect around 75% of your impact in IT to come from scope 3. That means the broader supply chain of where you get all your technology from, but equally, depending on your definition, what you're offering down to your clients. I think you can see really succinctly where the word sustainability is being used too broadly to talk about something that's very narrow. In the consumer space, we see a lot of things that say this was built with sustainability right at its very heart, when actually what they've done is really just made the packaging compostable. Don't get me wrong, I like a bit of compostable packaging, but that doesn't make the product sustainable. Okay, so how do we define sustainability in a broader way? I mean, unfortunately, some of this heavy lifting's been done for us. The UN have done a good job of talking about their sustainable development goals. And for us, we believe this represents a much broader definition of sustainability that can be really useful here. And the 17 development goals can be, if you've done thoughtfully, a very useful place to start with a nice broad definition and then narrow that down to the things that we think apply. Now, we've talked about carbon, so that fits very tidily in the climate action goal, which is goal 13 in their definition. We're talking about the consumption use of IT products and services. Well, that can fit, of course, in responsible consumption and production. But beyond that, where else do we think IT fits in this broader definition of sustainability? Well, we've talked a bit about data centers, and we've talked a bit about extraction. Well, in extraction, lots of water is used. So we know when we're talking about IT that there is an element of water. But more tangibly, in the data centers and the cloud services we use, water is used to cool those data centers. And guess what? For the most part, that is drinking water that goes in. Of course, it's not drinkable when it comes back out. So we know that there is an element of water when we're talking about technology. Likewise, when we talk about life on land, remember we talked about the destruction of land and potentially forests when extracting materials for IT, but equally, when we no longer need technology, if we let it become waste, how that can be poisonous and affect land. But I've also listed no poverty here. This is number one, the first element on the Sustainable Development Goals. How can that link to technology? Or as I said, if you start with this as a wide definition, when you start to look through the lens of technology and start making decisions, you can see you can affect a lot of these other goals inside of the UN's definition. So if, for example, when you finished using your technology, you donated your technology, you could help reduce tech poverty. Now, tech poverty is a real thing, right? There's a big social divide when it comes to technology. And if you actually donated old technology, you could actually start to reduce the impact of tech poverty on society. So that you can see through this lens, there are lots of different ways you can impact and affect and measure sustainability using this lens. Now, our suggestion isn't that you try and tackle all 17 in one go. We would recommend focusing on 3 to 5 areas that you think really fits with what your organization does and what it's trying to serve, but keep that lens wider for when you're making other decisions and how you can impact different areas. I hope that's helpful. Now, when we talk about measuring sustainability, the real key theme here in this conversation, it's important that we don't just look at what our needs are today. This is a very rapidly moving space, and I think we need to think at least sort of 3 to 5 years out to know what we should be measuring, how are we measuring it, to make sure that we're not always just playing catch up as things like legislation and expectations change. So where are we at right now? So if we map out the sort of the next 5 years, where we're at today is largely focused on carbon reporting, right? We don't need to ignore that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a good place to start. And as I said, most people are kind of focusing on scopes 1 and 2 from an emissions point of view. And a lot of this is for organizations that aren't already under legislation, or not already having to respond to TFCD or CRSD. This has been driven by expectation across different shareholders. And for the most part, this measurement is being estimated by spend. Okay. Now, let's think about measuring by spend for a moment. How accurate do we think measuring by spend is? So if we go back to talking about laptops, talk about laptops a lot. Think about this example. You have 2 customers who are buying, one customer is buying 1 laptop and the other customer is buying 100 laptops. Who do we think would get the better price? I think it's safe to say if you're buying 100 laptops, you'd expect a better price, right? Maybe 15, 20% cheaper even. But does that mean each of those laptops have 15 to 20% less emissions embodied in them? Well, of course it doesn't. And therefore, you can see immediately how spend is quite a limiting metric when we're talking about measurement. Now, it is what we have, and certainly it's better than nothing, and it starts the right kind of conversations. That it's not to say it's not a reasonable starting point. But as we move forward and we think logically about how we think measurement's going to progress, we start to see that it's not going to be sufficient. So, of course, the purpose of reporting isn't just for the sake of reporting. The purpose of reporting and measuring sustainability factors is reduction. And we'll see that, lots of countries have signed up to reduction targets. And what we'll see as legislation gets stronger, what it's driving us to do is actually reduce our footprint. And we will absolutely see that the scopes 1, 2, and 3 will be mandated. We see that in existing legislation. We can expect that to continue. But we're going to see the expectation of how that data is derived to increase. So at some point, spend is going to be insufficient as an accuracy marker. I can't tell you exactly when that's going to be, but that we can expect that to happen. And we can already see across Europe and in different parts of the world that a broader definition, a broader set of requirements way beyond just carbon. As I said, already in the US, they're talking about water, and other countries they're talking about biodiversity. We've got to be quite clear that whilst carbon might be the focus today, it's not going to be the only focus tomorrow. And then stretching this view out a little bit further, perhaps to sort of 5+ years out, let's think about that 2030 line. If any of you are living in this space will know 2030 is an important benchmark. We were supposed to have halved our emissions by then. We know we're going to be looking at, or still looking at, scope 1, 2, and 3. Carbon's not going away. We don't expect that to change, but we will be expecting legislation and other things forcing us more to look at more broadly different elements of sustainability. It will move from just legislation to taxation, because the only other levers governments really have to force reduction rather than just reporting, right? And I think what we're seeing, and I think it's quite consistently, is that at some point, because money's going to come into it, because your ability and to control how much tax you pay is going to come down to how much you can accurately prove you've reduced your emissions, that this data, the requirement on this data, is going to have to be able to be audited, and audited at a really high level. So is spend going to be sufficient a metric at the point when we're auditing and it's affecting taxation? Almost certainly not. And I've said a few times about these other measures that we can expect to come into this reporting landscape, expect to have focus. I think in IT, we're talking a lot about critical materials. These devices that we own have lots of rare critical metals and minerals in them, and particularly here in the EU, we have a very limited supply of them, so it's going to be carefully controlled. There will be increasing pressure around waste, and particularly e-waste, and reducing and removing that. And we've talked already a bit about water use and the role of nature in here. So I think you can expect those elements to come into the reporting landscape over the next 5 years. So we're talking about measurement. Let's get into the actual process of measurement and what needs to happen. I think it's important to remember that measuring isn't one thing. I think we can easily oversimplify what we have to do when we're talking about measurement. Of course, the first thing we have to do is actually try and capture this kind of diverse sets of data from across our organizations to actually have something to look at and understand. Then, of course, we've got to analyze it. And a lot of this is unstructured data. It may be data we've not gathered before. We've got to get to the point where we can make this data useful, because until we do that, we can't do the sort of reporting back, the presenting of this data. But of course, going back to what we said right at the beginning, really what we need is to get to the point where we can glean insights from this data and actually act upon it. That's that making better decisions piece that we talked about. Now, the reason why I emphasize is I think people oversimplify this journey, and I think a lot of leadership teams, when they set goals, underestimate how difficult this is as a task and how intensive it is. You're asking lots of people across an organization to gather data that they have never thought about or never captured before. It's a lot of additional work, which creates quite a lot of pushback. Now, fortunately, there are some tools that exist today. I imagine most of you are trying to get your hands around some kind of tool to help you on this journey. And I just wanted to illustrate two that we've worked with at sort of at different ends of the spectrum that are quite useful. At the kind of sort of slightly more simplistic, easy to use end of the spectrum, perhaps targeted towards the mid-market and local government. I believe we've got some local governments joining us here today. It's something like Climate Essentials. Now, this is an online tool that's quite accessible, quite easy to fill in the data, to fill in the sort of the buckets of emissions that you need to complete this journey. It's quite a visual tool that allows you easily to represent and create reports to show your impacts. It also helps you build a sort of pathway of reduction and can help you with some basic insights of the areas you should focus on, what you can do, and sort of pencil in savings so you have your reduction plan. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got something like Microsoft Sustainability Manager. Obviously, this is designed much more for the larger, more complex enterprise. Now, these tools are very powerful. They're designed to be able to easily integrate into other platforms and services. It's really designed to automate some of this and take some of the heavy lift away. They're quite good at the ability to have the ability to abstract out data and see the holistic view, but also zoom in, perhaps country by country, and get right down to emissions at different levels. Now, obviously, these two platforms exist at very different end of the spectrum, very different cost points, and you might expect to pay something like £2,000 a year to use Climate Essentials, perhaps more like 15,000, 20,000 to use something like Microsoft Sustainability Manager. And for that tool, this Sustainability Manager, you've got to expect you're going to need some implementation support as well. You're probably going to need some integration, some support there. Now, if you know we're on your journey here and you want some more support and tools, let us know. We can introduce you to organizations that can support you in this space. Okay. So on that point, right? So I've already told you that spend is going to be insufficient to get through that journey. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what do we do to get beyond spend? How can we get more accurate data than spend? So for us, working in this space, we did a lot of research to find data. How can we provide more accurate data to our customers? And in a lot of areas, it just simply didn't exist. people hadn't actually calculated the carbon footprint of certain types of devices. Let's think about networking equipment. Haven't actually analysed what this product has from a carbon footprint point of view. So we went and worked with a third-party environmental consultancy firm to do it ourselves, to actually try and calculate as accurate as we could what the footprint was. And this is what that process looks like. So we called it the teardown, and you can see why. Like, that's us physically taking apart products, getting them back to their raw metals and minerals and weighing them, and then reverse engineering the calculation of what it would take to transport, manufacture and extract those materials, and adding that up and building a data picture of what does it look like to make those devices. So the first output of that was a model. We had an Excel model that could show us, put in a product code, see how much different materials were embodied by weight. We see how much carbon was embodied in that journey too. And that immediately started to allow us to help customers, first of all, report that. So we could create reports that could show them their impact, but also allow them to make better decisions. So here you can see we've made a comparison. What does it take to deploy remanufactured technology versus new technology? How much carbon or materials can be saved in that process? And now what we've done is expanded that journey now to build a platform. So a software-driven platform where people log in, can upload their own information, their own sets of products and services, and actually get estimates based on the carbon footprint and the materials used and deployed in that space. Now, obviously, this is quite an intensive process. You're not going to do it for everything you have in your IT environment. And of course, we're expecting suppliers over time to provide more and more of the information that we're providing here. But I'd encourage you to think about in the core of what you deliver, are there things that you should be getting to beyond spend, to getting to this level of estimation? Because it is still estimation. The only way you could absolutely know for certain what a carbon footprint is of a product or service is to do a full supply chain audit. And there are companies that are starting to do that. But I'd imagine you'd only ever look at that if it's absolutely fundamentally core to the thing that you're delivering. It's very expensive and time intensive. So what we've got here is a much better estimation than spend, but it's still an estimation. And we believe this will stand up to the high levels of scrutiny over the next 5 years. But yeah, LCAs are a useful way to get beyond spend. So when we're working with organizations, when we talk about IT, often it's quite abstract. We're talking about devices and software and things like that. When we're talking about measurement and obviously ultimately reduction of impacts, really these journeys start with people. So even though we're measuring and it's data, we're measuring IT, which is equipment and services, it starts with people. And it often starts with leadership teams, because you've got to get them bought into why this is important. You've got to create some awareness in that space. Often leadership teams have never even spent a dedicated session purely talking about sustainability and agreeing where the organization is going to go. Because critically, if you're going to actually do something more than just measure, you're going to actually get to reduction, you need the business processes, you need the leadership team signed up to incorporating this into core strategy. Okay, and once you've got the organization aligned to that, you've set your goals, maybe you've picked the elements of the 17 SDGs you're going to address, then what you really need to do if you want to make change and create impact is engage the whole organization. Now, this is important just from a reporting point of view, because it is a heavy lift. As I said, you're going to be asking lots of people to do more work in new areas and learn new skills to be able to do this. But equally, when it comes to reduction, it is the full body of the organization you need to do that. Even forward-looking organizations have relatively small teams focusing on sustainability and ESG relative to the impact the organization is making. So you need to engage the organization. And I think it's only then really where the measurement becomes so important. That's obviously you've got to get through some kind of baseline exercise where you are now, some estimation of what the current view is. But of course, as you start to run programmatic change, it's the equivalent of putting those brakes on. You need to be able to measuring those reductions. And when we're talking about technology, I guess there's two things to think about. There's obviously what you already have in train, what is already being used, what has already been deployed. And there's loads you can do there to impact that and reduce the environmental impact of IT already. And we're going to play a little game in a minute to do that for decarbonisation. But of course, you also have a really important role when designing new solutions. So what is the organization going to adopt? What is going to be new and what is going to be changed? So it's very important that early on in the journey, if you're talking about measurement, these measures go into new projects and goals for reduction are designed in rather than trying to be retrofitted afterwards. Okay, so as promised, we're going to play a little game. Now, we call it the decarbonized tech game. Now, I'm going to say some things that are relatively straightforward, right? These are simplistic ideas. I'm going to ask you in the chat to respond with what kind of percentage reduction you think it could have on some part of the carbon footprint. Okay, so yeah, be ready just to throw out, and like no one's judging here, just throw out some guesses of what kind of reduction you think we could expect by doing some of these things. So the first one is something known as dark mode. I don't know how many people are familiar with dark mode, but turning dark mode on basically takes what is traditionally a kind of white screen with a little bit of black text on and inverts it. So it's a black screen with a little bit of white text on. Dark mode reduces the amount of energy, the amount of photons your screen has to produce to send that light to your eyes. Anyone want to hazard a guess how much energy you could save by using dark mode? We have a bold start of 60%. Okay, 40%. Well, very good. Well, okay, interesting. We've got very different views here. So we've got a range of sort of 5% to about 60%. So of course, as with all things like this, it does depend, right? So on a device like my laptop here that doesn't automatically correct for brightness, it's about 40%. On a device that like your phone that might automatically adjust for brightness, it might be a little bit less. But what we can see is it's a meaningful reduction. And what have you lost? Right, and think about this, and this is again why you have to engage the whole organization. Think about your users. What would they have lost if they switched to dark mode? There is a small adjustment, right? Your eyes, it does take a few days to go, well, can I read that as easily as I could before? But fundamentally, you can reduce 40%, around 40%, by just switching on dark mode across your devices. Interesting stuff. And I did say they were simple, by the way. So what about using technology for longer? I gave an example to you earlier of a company that used to recycle their laptops after just 2 years. So how much benefit do you think we could get by extending the life of the technology we use? Anyone want to hazard a guess from a percentages term of how much impact we could have from using things for longer? Another good range, 70%, 60%, 20%, 50%. Firstly, thanks for the engagement. It's nice to have some bit there. So we've got a very good range there. So obviously, again, it depends, but that's in that example, right? So laptops. So useful life of a laptop can actually be around about 10 years. And again, this does vary, but and the use case might change. So it might be that it's used for 2 to 3 years in an organization, then it gets upgraded. So maybe some more memory added, which gives it another 2 to 3 years. So let's say that takes us up to 6 years. And then maybe the use case changes. Maybe it becomes a laptop for a child at school. Maybe we're addressing tech poverty and we've downgraded the operating system and just put on browsers and simple tools like that. But we can extend, and this is pretty well documented, a piece of technology there from what is currently being used at 2 years to 10 years. So depending on how you do your maths, that's a pretty considerable increase, well, decrease, if you like, in terms of the embodied carbon, because you're preventing the replacement of those devices. And people aren't needing to buy another device in that journey. Okay, now we're going to see if you guys were paying very close attention earlier. What about using remanufactured technology instead of brand new technology? Did anyone spot that earlier in the presentation? How much carbon? Very good, Sophia. Straight on the money there, right? So 62%, and that was for one particular product, but around 60% less carbon embodied in a remanufactured device than a new device. And let me be precise about my definition of remanufactured technology. We're talking about technology that has been completely remanufactured by the original vendor. Okay, it comes with their warranties, their guarantees, same software licenses, same accessories, same everything, treated the same after sale. Okay, so not only are you reducing the footprint there around 60%, but you're also reducing cost. Nearly all remanufactured equipment comes with substantially lower cost. We're talking at least sort of 15 to 20% cheaper. So again, you can start to see where some of these cost savings come in. But what else could you do in your organization to reduce your footprint by 60% and still fundamentally have exactly the same thing that you were looking to acquire? It's powerful stuff, right? So next one. I love this one because it just sounds so simple, right? What about switching off our technology when we're not using it? Anyone want to hasten how much energy we could save in there? So we've got 25%, 30%, 40%, 33. Okay, well, that's quite a slightly narrow band there. Thank you. So well, let's do some quick and dirty maths, right? So let's assume we're talking about office buildings, and let's say what's working days 9 to 5, but let's say that the technology in a building, we should have it on between 7 till 7, so 12 hours a day for only 5 days a week, because of course most of us don't work weekends if we're fortunate enough. So that actually means only 35% of the week is that technology being used. And if we switched it off the rest of the time, we'd be saving 65%. Because guess what? Basically, no business turns off all of its technology at the weekend. It might turn off some, people might shut down their computers, but do you think they turn off their access points? Do you think they turn off the switches, the routers? No. So there's a massive opportunity there. Yeah, absolutely right, Dan. Like lights on, often heating on, but yeah, even just the technology itself has a really big saving potential. Right. So the final one here, and then we're going to open the floor for some questions. What about deleting data? What kind of impact could we have if we changed our habits around data? Anyone has a guess how much potential we have to reduce our environmental footprint by deleting data? 80, 90, 90. 200%. Oh yeah, maybe. I don't know if that was meant to be 200 or that was 200%. So look, I can't give you an exact figure. No one's done exact science, but here's a stat for you that is relevant. So IBM did a bit of research that showed that 90% of all the data we store is never retrieved. So 90% of everything that we're storing in these data centers that are consuming vast resources is never retrieved. I'm not going to tell you that's immediately a 90% energy saving, but if we reduced our demands on data centers, if we reduced the demands of networks by not transmitting all this data, it's definitely a very substantial saving that we're talking about here. So thank you for playing my game. I hope that was a little bit more interactive. I'm going to talk about some key takeaways, and then we're going to open the floor for questions, right? So look, I want you to go away with the knowledge that the IT is a big footprint. It has a big part. Now, it may not be 40% in your organization, but it is going to be 14% of global emissions, and I'm almost certain it'll be in the top 4 or 5 things you're going to need to address if you're going to looking at sustainability. You know, we talk a lot about the physical devices in IT, IT and software, and it's all very technical, but so much of this journey revolves around people. It starts in leadership, in leadership teams, and in setting some goals and deciding what you're going to measure, but it fundamentally requires people to measure it, to gather the data, but of course to change behaviors and break down some of these policies and processes that are causing this massive impact. not least of all, perhaps, how you're managing data. But that activity really only works, it really only happens when you increase awareness across your whole organization. So that's whether that's awareness in your leadership teams or awareness across everyone in your businesses. Where are these impacts in IT? As humans, we're quite good. We don't like waste. Like if you can show people where waste is being created, if you can show them where inefficiencies are, we naturally start to make better decisions. But that motivation starts from awareness. It starts from understanding some of the things we've talked about today. Yeah, I think it's very important here that we set big ambition. And I know a lot of people are kind of slightly hesitant about setting big, broad definitions around sustainability because we're worried about greenwashing. Well, the fears around greenwashing is overstating your position. It's not overstating your ambition, it's overstating your position. So I think it is good to have a big, broad definition of what you're going to look at from a sustainability point of view, setting some big ambitions about reducing, but being extremely transparent and honest about where you're at on that journey. That's how you make the biggest impact, but without taking the risks of being called out for overstating your position, right? But I also see the benefit, I talk big and bold, but I also see the benefit of starting small and specific. So think about the things that are easy to measure. So we talked about e-waste as an example. I don't think it would be that big a project in your organization to measure your e-waste and to set a bold goal of, well, could we in a year sort of halve that? You know, maybe getting some stuff reused, maybe donating some of it. You know, could we attend to that and use that as a case study of, look, draw attention to something, put some focus, set a goal, engage the team, do something about it, and get that momentum, get that confidence that you can actually affect these things in sustainability terms. Okay. And look, the final bit I want to leave you with is something that's talked a lot about in sustainability terms is you can't do this alone. Like I say, you can't go circular alone, which is referring to the circular economy, right? Reach out to others, like whether it's helping with the strategy and helping get your leadership teams on board, whether it's how do you create that spark and that energy and getting the whole organization engaged in helping here, or whether it's the really practical stuff of how do we adopt remanufactured technology? How can we measure networking equipment in a more accurate way? How can we extend the life of our technology? Like, that's certainly why we exist, and we'd be very, very willing to help you. So look, that's the end of the core part of this presentation. So I've a little bit longer than the 45 minutes, but I'm very willing to open up the floor to questions. So I don't know if anyone wants to drop a question in the Q&A, or we could potentially, if I'm technical enough, to allow people to kind of raise their hands and we could open up the mics and you can ask the question directly. So I don't mind either way. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask?
Anthony, I think there was one that popped up in the chat sort of midway through the session. So it was around when you were talking about how we've done the teardown at Circularity-First.
Yeah.
Why is it that we don't have those values from manufacturers in the first place?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, ultimately, that's where we can hope that we'll get the data from over time. A lot of the manufacturers actually don't have the data. It might sound funny, but a bit like all our organizations, they haven't actually ever had to ask the question. So there's a bit of that. And then there's probably subtly, more quietly behind the scenes, a little reticence of giving this information when others aren't. Is it going to be used sort of competitively? Will people stop buying when they see how big these impacts are? I think that there is an element of fear. So I think, yeah, both sides of that equation, a bit of fear and a bit of actually not having that information. We do start to see behind the scenes some of these organizations starting to give a little bit of this insight into this space. Does anyone else have any questions they want to throw in the chat or the Q&A? Does anyone else want to put their hand up and ask a question? Got one from my own team here who wants to ask a question. But anyone else? Soren, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I would. Would it be fair to say, when we're talking about the question that was asked before from why we're not getting this data from manufacturers, that they're simply not maybe interested in bringing out this information because it will ultimately, I guess, kind of kill the manufacturing of new and shiny products, because we are, the biggest results come from reusing existing technology for longer. Would that be a fair assumption?
That's it. I think fear definitely has a play here, but I think like everyone's still finding their way, right? And I think there's also not just the fear that the impacts are large and that people might not like those, but fear that maybe they're not 100% certain on their numbers. I know some of the vendors we work with, they're very careful about sharing the detail because they're not sure, right? So exactly what I said. So even doing a life cycle assessment, they're still estimates, right? They don't want to be kind of pulled across the coals because maybe they got their own numbers wrong, right? And this is emerging space. We've got a question here from Glyn. I'm going to try and unmute you, Glyn.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm unmuted. So I'm ICT business partner working in local government and supporting schools with their IT.
Yeah.
Now in Wales, we've got this project. It's been going for about 4 or 5 years called the EdTech project. So Welsh government are providing several £million a year to schools across Wales to replace their devices.
Yeah.
But there is a catch. And that catch is that if you want the funding, you've got to commit to replacing those devices every 5 years. And interestingly, they call it a sustainability agreement. So whether those devices are trash in 5 years or not, those schools have got to replace them. So that to me is government isn't encouraging that sort of carbon sustainability by saying, oh no, 5 years, if you want this, if a primary school wants £20,000 to buy, a few hundred laptops, then you've got to commit to replace those. But there's no plan as to what happens to those laptops that I buy for the school today in 5 years' time from Welsh government.
Unfortunately, we see this quite a lot, don't we? And I'm sure we could probably see those policies again, right? Running a policy, So, I mean, there are things you can do there, right? So I guess you could look at, if you're mandated to replace them, could you replace them with remanufactured laptops rather than new ones? But I guess you could also, is there room to push back and say, well, what about upgrading? Could we use that budget to upgrade the laptops or something else? And you're right to point out, well, someone needs to come up with a solution. What are we going to do with all these laptops at the end? Do we give the families, perhaps a chance to buy the old laptops so the kids have one at home? How can we make sure that after 5 years, all that technology doesn't become waste, right? So I feel you and I hear you. I mean, it's interesting because the central government has written some really interesting policy in this space. I don't know if you've written the greening ICT policy that was written that came out of DEFRA a few years ago. There's some quite good thinking in pockets. It's just not very joined up. Thank you, though, for the question. We've got another one here. I saw it flash up. Got a few. I would say even without accurate data or even estimates from all part of your organization, you can really start making decisions to reduce your impact. Absolutely. How companies fight programmed obsolescence? Oh, very good one. Yeah. Even considering extend the lifetime of equipment, we end up having issues with the suppliers, with the software not running internally and with colleagues complaining about technical issues. Sophia, that is a really good question, and it's kind of multi-dimensional, which you sort of allude to. So there's obviously accelerated obsolescence, which is essentially pushed by the individual vendors. So they will accelerate, pushing people through a life cycle largely because they want to push a later and greater generation of product. But then there is also at some point, what are the actual physical limitations or the software limitations of those devices themselves? So whilst you can't prevent a vendor, end of sailing or end of lifing a device, you do still have choices. We certainly got some really interesting use cases where we've helped customers extend beyond what was recommended from the vendor, and we were able to illustrate that was safe and reliable. Often it might be making sure you've got your own portfolio of spares and that the platform has been sufficiently and securely tested beforehand to make sure you don't believe there are any kind of risks associated with extending the life of that. The software piece is probably where it ends up being the most contentious, because what organizations will say is, well, yeah, of course the physical device will keep running, but we're no longer going to give you software updates or patches. So this is my own personal opinion. Okay, so careful, because it's just opinion. Is that generally speaking, when platforms have been running sort of for 5 to 10 years, normally at that point when the vendor's kind of pulling the plug on them, the need for those software patches, if there had been a major need for that, it would have come up earlier in the journey, right? It would have, if there had been an exploit from a security point of view, if there had been a bug in the software, that for the most part, those devices would have already experienced it and a patch would have already been resulted. Now, that is my opinion, and we've seen it play out in different organizations. I guess those are the policies you've got to discuss and agree what level of risk you're willing to adopt in your own organization, right? And I think it will vary perhaps on different platforms, different types of technology, thinking about, where are your vulnerabilities? Would you do it for an access point? Well, probably. Would you do it for a firewall? Perhaps not. I hope that answers your question. All right, Adrian, manufacturers are starting to be penalized for this kind of behavior, though. For example, Apple was fined for reducing the, yeah, that's true. So can you not make sure they're being repurposed? Sorry, so there's two questions. Well, there's a statement and a question there. So I still don't think manufacturers are being pushed very hard. I think you'll still find most manufacturers push their latest and greatest product and retire their old products before they have been fully used. Yeah, Apple went further, right? They didn't just say, oh, we're no longer letting you upgrade the iOS. They literally reduced the performance of the device. So yeah, it's a good sign, but I think we've not seen enough pressure being put there. Stephen, on the flip side, they're also trying to offer discounts on new mobiles by sending back old. Yeah, and that's a difficult thing, isn't it? We actually did a load of science on this, and we produced something called the Baker curve of what is the price journey of a product over time. And you're right, actually, often the cheapest point to buy a product is really early on in its life cycle sometimes, because it's heavily incentivized to get adoption. Then the kind of price goes up because everyone wants one. And slowly over time, it kind of goes down with a little peak at the end, just before it goes kind of an end of life. Discounting, yeah, I mean, because obviously price drives the things. But if you think about it, if you could use technology for longer, for example, it's quite hard to compete against that, right? It's quite hard to give a discount that's bigger than keeping what you've got in place for longer. Right. But like all things, a lot of this comes down to what do you really need? What is the business outcome that's trying to be driven? Do we really need, for example, with phones, like I'm blown away by the new Samsung phone that's got 6 cameras on it, 6 cameras, right? I'm not pretty enough to I'm definitely not pretty enough to need 6 cameras. I don't know about you. Okay. Right. Well, any good laugh to this. Any other questions? You're right, Stephen. Yeah, they also sell refurb. Lots of, yeah, and that's definitely something to look at. Lots of vendors now starting to sell refurbished. We can definitely get more behind that. But any other questions for anyone before we close? We're just dead on time. I'm happy to carry on if anyone's got any additional questions. Well, look, I'm extremely grateful for you spending your time with us today. A recording of this will be available, so if there are other colleagues you'd like to see it, happy to share. And of course, if there's anything we can do to help you on this journey with the advisory, with awareness, or helping you adopt remanufactured equipment, as we've talked a bit about that, then we'd be very happy. And you're very welcome. Thank you for your thanks. Pleasure to have you all on board, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much. Goodbye.